Hello, welcome back to our book chat about this book, Traces of Violence, Writings on the Disaster in Paris, France. This is part 2 of a discussion of the book. In part 1, we talked with the authors of the book, Robert Desjarlais and Khalil Habrih, as well as Ursula Rahl, a director here at the Institute. And we covered many of the main themes of the book. In part 2, we've been joined by 2 PhD students from Leipzig University, Melody Howse, who's a visual anthropology, whose project is looking at racial encounters in the body in Berlin, and Friederike Eichner, who is looking at minor refugees in a shelter in Eastern Germany. Okay, so welcome everyone to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if we can turn to maybe the first topic, I should say that in this discussion we're really interested in your own research and how it sort of relates to and speaks back to the themes that are covered in the book. So one of the main themes that the book deals with is the question of hauntings, spectrality, silence. Now, is this something that you have encountered in your own research in the refugee shelter, Friederike?
Yes, this is quite an important topic for my research too, and I was very inspired by the book, which gave me another perspective on this topic of ghosts and haunting, which I already engaged with a little bit. Just to give you like a picture of the shelter, I wanted to talk a little bit about a story that I encountered there in the shelter. The shelter is located, it's a small building located at the outskirts in the suburbs of a city in Eastern Germany. It's a repurposed building, so it's very old, and the original purpose of the building was not for the shelter. It's a small shelter, like 16 people in total can live there. The residents are very mixed, so they are coming from very different places, from Eastern and Western Africa, North Africa and Middle East, from Afghanistan and Syria. So it's a very heterogeneous group, and the shelter is, as you already mentioned, it's a special group in the European migration system. They are called unaccompanied refugee minors and are sheltered in other structures and facilities than adult refugees. So, and the story I wanted to talk about is when like a moment of haunting was happening in the shelter. When a young resident left the shelter, he escaped from the shelter and did not say goodbye or did not announce the plans to the caregivers there. But he decorated his room before leaving. He took all of his stuff and left balloons in the room, and he draped also like a scarf on one bed, and he left 2 posters there. And the posters, they were like he painted a face with his social media alias on the head, and besides of the face he wrote that he is almost dead, mentally dead, and he had written many other things there in Arabic and Google translated German, and try to say goodbye in this way, and also say something about his condition, which was like a condition of suffering and depression and not knowing where to go, but having the feeling that he needs to leave the shelter. He told them that he's grateful for the aid he was receiving there. So it was like a way of saying goodbye, but in a way which was unintelligible. Okay, so sorry.
Unintelligible.
Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah.
In a way that was unintelligible for the staff there, who tried to make sense out of these posters and out of this gesture, the objects he left. And his absence was like a ghostly absence then, because they couldn't make sense out of his escaped from the shelter? Was he depressed? Was he just trying to find a better place, a bigger city, for example, where to live in? So there were a lot of different interpretations, but his absence was experienced as a kind of haunting because people wanted to help and couldn't help. So I started to engage with this kind of questions. What is happening there between staff and residents who try to work together for like improving the situation of the residents, and why it fails so often. And I think the question of understanding and not being able to communicate, or not being able to communicate in meaningful ways, is very important, because this inability to really understand each other leaves these traces and leaves like certain ideas and impressions, but people never really know who they are and with whom they are talking, and what kind of relationships they have. And then people often leave the shelter. I mean, it's happening regularly that people escape from the shelter, so then they leave the staff behind, you know, being like or having all these questions in mind why people left.
So it seems like there's a lot of ambivalence associated with these material traces. Robert, is that something that you find really speaks to the book?
Yeah, I think so. In very direct ways. There's the sense of not really knowing what's happened or what's going to happen in the future. There's a kind of opacity, a kind of unclarity. This person's history was probably unknown to the residents, to the staff of the shelter, right? And not really knowing what happened to him. And I imagine that from his perspective, the whole political structure of shelters and governmental care in Germany has a kind of spectral dimension too, right? Who is out there to help him, who's impeding his progress in life, and it's probably very oblique and indirect in terms of how these structures work. And so there's a whole ground of spectrality I think you're encountering in the shelter. It strikes me. Perhaps that makes sense to you, Friederike.
Yeah, it makes sense, because this was actually also my kind of thought that the residents appear ghostly, but what is ghostly in the end is more the environment in which they live, and the kind of sheltering structures and care structures in which they have to navigate, and where like the state is also trying to get hold of people, to put them at one place and to get to know their biographies. I mean, they are interrogated a lot, and they don't always know why they are interrogated and why people want to know about them, and what this is bringing for the future for them. So I think another aspect of the story was actually that the person who escaped was suspected to be maybe a terrorist, because this category of traumatized minors is especially in the focus of the authorities, who are afraid of attacks in Germany. And so usually if one escapes and staff have the impression that he could be suicidal or depressed, intelligence services are showing up there. So the state, of course, is partaking in the production of these ghosts, which then become the escaped residents of the shelter. Yeah.
Right. So all these apparatuses of care and surveillance kick in, right? But it's all founded on the phantasm of what's happening in the shelter in that moment, and then things get generated out of that.
Okay, maybe if I could turn the question to you, Melody. The people that you worked with in Berlin their experiences were often haunted in particular ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of a different type of haunting, but I think we're talking about the same things about the institutions and structures of power which become the haunting apparatus. And so I think I could just pick up from where Friederike was, that another example was living inside or kind of traversing these areas called KPOs, or Kriminalitätsbelasteten Orte, and you have them in Paris as well. And
so that means like a crime prone area.
Yeah.
So
how you would translate it?
Exactly. So an area of high crime. And then I think you even have them in like Leipzig and places like that as well. But so they're just areas which have been designated through crime rates as being areas of kind of interest. But these are often migrant neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, and are over-policed as well. So this is one of the areas where these kinds of hauntings kind of take place, because in these spaces you get not just over-policing, but you get racial profiling, you get stop and search, which speaks directly to the work that Khalil and Robert have produced, which really looks deeply into that. And so there's many examples, but I can give you one of this young man who was just walking home one night, and he didn't know, for example, that he was in a KBO, because their edges are often ambiguous. And if you don't know where they are, then you don't know you're in one until you get stopped, until you realize that you don't have any kind of recourse to get out of the hold in which you're in. And so he tries to get home, he tries to walk across the road, and the police say, no, you can't go there, you have to go back. But he's like, I just live across the road. And so this to and fro happens between them, and he's with his pregnant partner, and they both get pushed up against the wall. And this makes him stressed out, of course. He's watching his partner being held against the wall, and he starts to panic, and he starts to try and break free. And the more he tries to escape, the more pressure is put on top of him. And so the police act in this strange concertina way: release, hold, release, hold. And in the end, he is arrested in a way where they try to force him in the back of a van inside a cage. Inside the van, there's a small cage, which he's told he must get inside the cage, although there's seats in the van, and he's the only person at this point. And this is after he's given his identification, he's been searched. And they've even been to his home at this point. And yet this is still encountering this kind of strange kind of process which happens. And so he gets arrested and taken for fingerprinting, photographing, and he's done nothing. They have found nothing, but yet they're continuing with their endeavor. And in the end, what he does is, to get out of it, he sits on the floor in this cell, and he just starts to meditate, because he realizes that everything he's doing is leading him down a path which he cannot escape from. And so he tries to just focus himself to try and move it out somehow. He tries to figure out, how do I respond differently now to make this stop? So he gets bailed out and he gets home, but this haunting continues, and it changes his whole being. And so from a point where he was someone who was very free, he becomes someone who, when he hears sirens, for example, just going down the street, he noticed, we're talking about it, and you can even tell when we're talking about it that his breathing changes, that he starts to feel anxious, and that he starts to notice that his heartbeat is faster, that he starts to sweat, that there's an anxiety which is inherent in the sonic kind of force, which is the siren of the police car, which then reminds him or triggers this experience that he's had. And I think further to that, it becomes even more than that. It becomes that he becomes one of these people who becomes hyper aware of his movements in space after that point, like over signaling when he's riding a bike, and like making sure he waits for the green man to cross the road, and trying to really inhibit himself physically so that he can navigate space safely. And I think this is what that kind of haunting does. It kind of really doesn't just like live in the psyche, but really becomes an embodied way of being in relation to these things. And I think this is what I saw quite a lot in your work as well.
Yeah, maybe, Khalil, would you like to respond to that? Because I feel like what Melody is describing there is resonates a lot with many of the descriptions that you wrote about in the book, and also something about the sort of somatic responses to those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, it's quite uncanny to see such parallels across, two European capitals, but two cities that are very different, and two countries that have had ways of handling their histories quite differently. I think one parallel is the fact that these are state categories that are used to structure space and organize and order space in a specific way. And I always thought this was a very French specificity and an interest for territory that I thought was specifically French. And to hear that Berlin police, despite the sort of what I understand to be the Länder specific forms of policing to each region and even within cities, to see this modus operandi to be reproduced in Berlin was very striking. And I think anthropologically what's interesting, well, you've got one first logic, that's the way that European states function, and harmonization across states is perhaps one of the clues to explain this similarity. And so that's one logic of anthropos. You've got another, which is the somatic responses, and how this type of authority and this type of ordering of space is also an ordering of bodies, and it produces behaviors, either through the form of meditative state that Melody is describing from this interlocutor, of finding a way to absorb that violence and canalizing it in such a way that calms you and stops further violence and stops the cycle of harm and detention that is produced through stop and search. Or an alternative to that is another somatic response, which is to resist in the moment and to further dig yourself deeper in these cycles of harm and detention. So I don't want to overstate how similar these things are, and sort of create these laws of anthropology of this is what happens when people are put under this type of duress. However, there are things that interrogate me profoundly to see these parallels across very different research sites and urban sites.
And when you discuss the kinds of responses to these very violent situations, it raises another theme that comes up in the book again and again, like how people respond to various forms of structural or institutional violence. And there's a concept of poesis that you develop in different forms, a sort of a creativity, like without wanting to sort of diminish maybe the limited scope that people often have. Do you find these moments of creativity in your research? Maybe Robert.
Yeah, I think it's certainly in the book, and this is a concept that Khalil particularly develops in certain chapters, and I hear this in Friederike's narrative of this man creating this. He could have just left the shelter, right? But he's creating a work of art in a way, and it's in some ways effective, but also it's ineffective because it doesn't quite communicate perhaps whatever he wishes to communicate. But there is this generative capacity, and so people are not just living in very dire situations of hardship, although that's certainly a dimension of people's lives. But there's joy, there's pleasure, there's celebration, there's creative making within the everyday. One thing maybe I could add to these reflections is I would think that this kind of somatic learning that you're talking about, it probably works in generational ways too, right? That it gets transferred between parents to children, and it becomes a larger collective haunting where these resonances, these traces of trauma and hardship get carried on, almost like a residue in the body and in collective memory as well. But there's also ways to work with the poesis of that too, to create works of art, to create archives that are owned by the peoples themselves, to create sort of reflections on what has happened, through time and history as well. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, when you were saying that, I was just thinking about the fact that one of the ways, the ways in which these I would say almost epiphenomenal kind of traumas that happen and that are intergenerational. I think that one of the things that kind of came to mind immediately was the somatic ordering you have of the body, which Khalil's talking about as well, which is also what you learn as children, which is like how to kind of move through space, especially in spaces of commerce as Black and brown kids. You learn that you are always under suspicion, or potentially always under suspicion, and that how you should move, or how you should always, not have your hands in your pockets, not, always get your receipt, things like this, things that you learn from your your mom or your dad or your sisters, and the way in which these become kind of sedimented. But then the counterpoint to that, which would be the poesis, is that actually there's, like in Berlin, in the Black communities, there's like dance is a huge thing, like the arts is a huge thing. And if I think about the work that happens there, as you know, the dance performances and these kind of healing spaces, which are that kind of come out of this recognition that these kind of the body is formed in this way, and to kind of reform it as a counter narrative. So I would say, I mean, that's the first thing that came to mind when we were thinking about that.
In a way, kind of constructing a counter body, a different kind of body that's different from the body of police, you know, harassment.
I guess like your body instead of the body which is being projected on top of you, which is like the criminalized or you know the body of suspicion. You kind of have to reclaim your body through movement, perhaps.
That's a good point. And particularly through movement, because there's a kind of freedom that's associated with movement often. And it's one's own movement rather than coerced movement.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It's almost like the complete opposite of being put in the cage in the police van.
Yeah, and if you can think of that as like some kind of gravity, you know, like I think Tina Camp says it perfectly, like the gravity of anti-blackness, and then this would be the anti-gravitational. This is the counterpoint. This is that fugitivity, this freedom, which comes through recognizing what's happening to you and then refusing to accept that this is all you can be and that you can find a way through that. And I think this is, I mean, we could go on for hours about this stuff, but yeah.
Very good, thank you.
Well, let's not maybe go quite that far. Maybe I'll bring you back in, Friederike. Like this talk of poesis, and does that sort of speak to your own research?
It does, definitely, and I was always intrigued. I mean, Melody and I have discussed our work very often, and also when I read your book about the multiple, very creative responses people in this situation develop, and also refusal is a really important concept in this context. And I think Robert already described it very well, how the person in the shelter had a very creative way of communicating. And on the other hand, especially in my case, in the shelter as a central infrastructure, the ambivalence gets also visible. And I like how you described the ghetto in Paris as, on the one hand, an exclusionary space, which is a demarcation of where people of which race live, and on the other hand, it's an important space of important social ties, and so there's always this ambivalence. And I discovered this in the shelter very often, that people can refuse the things, but they also have to cope. They have to find an arrangement with each other to proceed in their lives. And this is also creative often, so I think there is lots of creative responses, but also often limits to it too.
Did you find yourself also faced with this dilemma in your writing about the potential for sort of romanticizing people's lives in the face of institutional violence, and how you dealt with that in your writing?
Mm-hmm. Well, in studying, I think I'll pick that question up from through the prism of studying violence. There's always a risk, I find, in studying police violence, but this project started through also a look at political non-state violence. There's always a risk of overstating harm. Either way, overstating the sort of trauma that terrorism produced in a city, or overstating the presence of the police in the lives of young Black and North African young men in Paris. And so I both tried to not overstate, but still be true to the experience. And Damn, it's a hard question.
Or maybe can I push it to Robert? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, also that other side of there's always a danger of sensationalizing the violence and playing it up, and you know, I think we tried to be restrained in that way, not interviewing people directly and looking more at the indirect effects of the violence on life. So, and I, you know, I do think that we tried to attend to the different ways that people are creative within their lives. But, you know, exactly what you said, I don't think we're trying to romanticize it. I think whenever the music starts kicking in during the writing, you can hear the violins. I think we tried to cut back in that way, and on both sides of the equation.
Okay, I've got a better answer to that. I think when one looks at violence and tries to analyze violence, there's always a temptation to romanticize, censorship, to romanticize, to make this sensational and journalistic almost. Maybe not an urge, but a tendency towards that. And I think a good advice that I tried to give myself was that events and phenomena speak for themselves. And so that there is no need to overstate, but just to be true to what interlocutors convey to us. Is probably a helpful thing to do in order to avoid these sort of tropes of sensational, you know, televised almost forms of violence. In terms of engaging then with the types of poesis that subjects to violence then have to engage in order to survive, I think we can look at art and think of creativity in those terms. We can also look at the poesis that happens in terms of reshaping your subject position altogether, moving out of an urban space, running away from that space, trying to reshape your spirituality in a way that's underspoken and almost invisible, but fundamentally changes one's subject experience. And so these things are difficult to access when you're doing research because it's hard to then pry into someone's life. And what was helpful for me is that I was able to interact with the phenomena on a more personal level, and instead of asking direct questions, intuit and shape interview settings in such a way that these things could be underspoken but still present, and that I didn't have to overstate them in that way. I'm not sure if that answers your initial question.
That's great. Yeah.
Can I ask then, because when you were speaking, then I was thinking about the fact that in your work, it's autoethnographic, a lot of it as well. Like, does that then help? Because for me, this is one of the things which I found, which is quite an interesting parallel between what we're doing, is that we both put ourselves in very vulnerable positions within the work in which we write. And in terms of like not romanticizing violence and pulling back from this kind of point of over sensationalizing, did you find that you as being like using autoethnographic kind of methods, like writing from your own experience, was that a way in which you countered that?
I think so. And then it comes with very specific limits, as Friederike was saying, in terms of this type of research. I think it was helpful to step away from sensational descriptions of violence, because I then had a sort of intuitive personal relationship to it. In terms of it, one of the limits that I found with this method is that I didn't want to then overinvest this idea of standpoint. I thought that whatever experience I had, whatever autoethnographic writing I was able to produce, necessarily had to inform the rest of my analysis and inform whatever my interlocutors were saying. And I had an analytical and historical vocabulary and vernacular that was available to me through being a student that some of my interlocutors did not have. And so rather than say, I embody this experience, I am the fundamental subject, I am part of this community of experience, which is somewhat true. But I don't think that's where the truth lies for us as researchers. I think we then move through that vulnerability to inform whatever our research interlocutors are giving us generously.
Okay, so maybe that could take us to the final point of discussion tonight. That's the question of writing and our position as writers, because I think one of the things that this book brings out beautifully is, and precisely through this dialogical approach that you've taken, is how much and how problematic these different subject positions can be. And so I'm wondering, Friederike and Melody, about whether you've taken anything from this book that has affected the way you think about your own project of writing.
Yeah, I mean, I was really inspired by this work in general. I think it's a really beautiful and actually really important work. And I think the thing that I found most inspirational about it was actually the way in which you've collaborated in a way which I haven't really seen before, and in a way which I haven't seen many people share their title page as co-authors, even when that's been the case. And so I was thinking a lot about collaboration and about what collaboration like this can teach us differently about how we produce different things and how we produce knowledge in general. And my work is, it's kind of, there is lots of collaboration in different ways, but I've done something slightly different. Like I try and write a little bit in community. So I try and work with the people I'm working with all the time. I'm part of the community. So like you, Khalil, it's the same. These are the people who I live with and who I have lived with for decades. So I share my work with them. We talk about it. I theorize with them. It's like we're always in conversation. So it's not just, so it's a different way, but I think for me, I'm really, I was even saying to Friederike earlier, like, what would it mean to have somebody from the shelter, for example, writing, in collaboration with Friederike on her work? I mean, what would that then show as something different? So I just think this was actually a really important thing to see, how you did that from different positions and the ways in which you came to it. But for me, it's more about how would I try and implement what I've seen in your work is the next stage maybe for myself to try and take something like that up, because I think this is, a good, important thing to see.
Okay. Robert, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very good to hear. And I think it's also surprising for us. It wasn't like we were setting up an agenda or a model or a programmatic approach to anthropology, but it does seem like our work opens up possibilities for collaborative work, for dialogical encounters, not even simply with the authors involved, but with people within communities as well. So, it's nice to see that it's generating a oasis of collaboration in your work and perhaps others as well.
Okay, and Friederike, has reading the book or your engagement with the book also affected how you think about writing?
Yeah, it definitely has. And I think the book is very encouraging. It encouraged me to try to not to become like an authority in my writing or have like this voice or this position of a person who knows everything, but to continue with this fractured kind of writing. I think the book is a book on marginalization, discrimination, and also a book on writing ethnographies. I found so many really helpful words and phrases there about writing and ideas, which inspired me so much. And I think somewhere you wrote that we all write from a fractured space of non-mastery, and I really like this idea that writing is, we are never on the position of having to know everything, but we are always weak and powerless also as people who do an ethnography. And I, for example, did not do interviews with the shelter residents in my research, so I don't have their voices to give me authority. So I very often in my thesis, I have to go back on my own impressions, which are like very subjective. And people ask me then, but this is your impression. And what about the refugee voices, for example? But I didn't collect them because of the institutional context in which I did research. So the book empowered me somehow to be more brave, maybe to write a PhD with a lot of gaps and points where I cannot give like a definitive answer.
Right, yeah, writing, from the space of non-mastery, or as you said earlier on, writing even as a form of, how did you express it, wounding or
disquiet.
And the disquiet, writing towards a disquiet.
Mm-hmm. To fully appreciate the disquieting nature of the things that we study, I think is a good thing. It's very generative, and I feel like perhaps we're trained to attain mastery. I mean, we do masters and then doctoral degrees, and so I think we're being pushed towards a form of mastery. But having humility is actually a lot more generative, I think, for writing, and it allows us to, move through the sort of neurosis that writing induces. I think. I mean, I'm speaking from my own personal experience of being perpetually disquieted by the things I look at, and then the idea that I could fix some of that reality into words and images is terrifying to me. But I think it's actually a methodological tool, and so I'm all the more humbled now that I see that other students like myself are finding comfort, and like you said, Friederike, an invitation to be sort of brave and weak. I think for me is a really successful endeavor in writing.
Okay, well, I think that's a very disquieting and therefore generative place to end the conversation. So thank you all for this really stimulating talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.